The maple syrup was already on the stove when my phone rang. It was a Wednesday, just past 2 in the afternoon, and I had been reducing the syrup down to pour over a butter tart I'd made that morning. The kind my mother used to make, with the slightly runny filling that people either love or can't stand. I fall firmly in the love category. I have for 67 years. I almost didn't pick up. I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish sometimes that I had. My daughter's voice on the other end was careful. That is the word I would use. Careful. Not warm. Not excited. Careful. Like someone walking on ice and testing each step before committing their full weight. "Mom," she said, "I've been talking to my husband about the cabin." I turned the burner down. He thinks, we both think, that this summer might work better if it was just us. Just our family. The kids are getting older, and it would be nice for them to have a real home base up there. You understand, right? I did not understand, but I said, of course, because that is what I have always done. That is what women of my generation were trained to do without even realizing we were being trained. I put the phone down and I stood in my kitchen in Sudbury, Ontario, and I looked out the window at the birch trees in the backyard. They were just starting to come in, pale green and trembling, the way they always do in late May. My husband Harold used to say that birch trees never quite commit to being alive. They look surprised by it every spring. I used to laugh at that. Standing at the window that day, I did not laugh. I need to tell you about the cabin before I tell you the rest. Harold and I found the property in 1998. We were driving back from a wedding in Perry Sound, his cousin's daughter, a long reception, too much wine, and we took the back roads because Harold hated highways on summer evenings. He said the light was wrong on highways, too flat, no shadows. He was a man who noticed things like that. We came around a bend on a gravel road outside of Kilbear Provincial Park, and there was a handwritten "For Sale" sign nailed to a cedar post at the edge of a laneway. Just like that, no realtor, no listing, a handwritten sign. We pulled over. The property was 3.5 acres, with about 60 feet of Georgian Bay frontage. The water was flat and gray-green that evening, and the pines came right down to the shoreline, and Harold stood at the water's edge for a long time without saying anything. That was how I knew. We didn't have the money. We were both teachers. Harold taught geography at Lockerbie Composite, and I taught grade 4 at a French immersion school for 23 years. Teachers in Ontario in the late 90s did not have the kind of money you needed to buy waterfront property in cottage country, even on a gravel road, even with a handwritten sign. But Harold's parents had passed the year before, within 8 months of each other, and there was a small inheritance, not a fortune. Enough. We had been careful with it, keeping it in a GIC, talking about eventually using it for retirement. Harold was 51. I was 49. Retirement still felt like something that happened to other people. We bought the property for $84,000. We put $30,000 down and took a small mortgage at the credit union. We built the cabin ourselves over the following 3 summers. Harold's brother came up from Hamilton to help frame the walls. My sister Gloria drove from Thunder Bay with her husband, and they helped us put the roof on. We rented a truck and drove out to a salvage place near Barrie to buy the kitchen cabinets. I chose the stain myself, a warm honey color that Harold said made the whole room look like the inside of a beehive. He meant it as a compliment. We worked on that cabin the way people work on things they love. Slowly, carefully, with attention. The front porch was the last thing we built, the summer of 2001. Harold stood on it the morning we finished it and looked out at the bay and said it was the best thing he had ever built. He was not a sentimental man. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. He died the following March, a Wednesday morning. He went to school, taught 2 classes, walked to the staff room for coffee at morning break, sat down in a chair, and did not get up again. Cardiac arrest. He was 54 years old. I want you to understand what that cabin was after Harold died. It was not just a property. It was not just an asset. It was the last place where he had been purely, simply happy, where he had worked with his hands and built something from nothing and stood on the porch he built and looked at the water. Every summer I drove up from Sudbury, I could still feel the shape of him there. Not in a frightening way, in a gentle way, like warmth left in a stone. I went every summer from 2002 until the summer I am telling you about. 22 summers alone, and then later with my daughter and her husband, and eventually their 2 boys. The cabin became a family gathering place. I was glad of that. I wanted it to be used and loved and full of people. Harold would have wanted that too. My son-in-law's name is not important. What is important is that he is the kind of man who, when he enters a room, immediately begins assessing what belongs to him and what might belong to him in the future. I noticed this about him long before he married my daughter. I chose to overlook it because my daughter loved him and because it is not my place to tell my child who to spend her life with. He started suggesting improvements to the cabin around 2019. The dock should be extended, he said. The propane fire pit needed updating. The kayak storage was inefficient. I listened politely. I made some of the changes he suggested because some of them were reasonable. I made them because I wanted to, because it was my cabin. The summer of 2021, he booked it without asking me first. He sent a message, not a call, a message, saying they would be coming up the second week of August and would I make sure the water was turned on. I responded that I had already planned to be there that week. He said that was fine, there was plenty of room. He arrived with his parents. His parents. I had never been consulted. His mother rearranged my kitchen cupboards on the second day. I moved things back after they left. I did not say anything. I should have said something. The following summer, he suggested, and I use that word loosely, that rather than my driving up every few weekends, it might make more sense for me to visit once, maybe in July, and let him manage the property for the season. He used the word manage. He said he could take care of maintenance issues, look into getting the dock permit updated, maybe put in a garden. I told him I appreciated the offer, but that I managed the property myself. He did not bring it up again that summer. I thought the conversation was over. It was not over. That May, when my daughter called to tell me not to come for the summer, I knew immediately that this had been building for a long time. I knew it the way you know. A storm is coming, not because you saw the clouds, but because the air changed. I had been feeling the air change for 2 years, and I had told myself I was imagining it. I drove up to the cabin the following weekend, a Friday, overcast, with that particular Ontario gray that isn't depressing if you've lived here long enough and know it will break. I had my key. I had always had my key. I had the original key from when we put the lock on in 1999. The lock had been changed. I stood on the porch, Harold's porch, and I put my key in the lock and it did not turn. I tried it twice. I looked at the door, at the new hardware, shiny and wrong-looking against the old cedar frame. Then I sat down on the porch steps and I looked at the bay. The water was very still. There was a loon somewhere out past the point calling. I sat there for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt. I felt something I had not expected to feel. I had been prepared to feel angry. I had been prepared to feel hurt, or used, or disrespected, all the things that were true and that I had every right to feel. But what I actually felt, sitting on those porch steps looking at that water, was something quieter than all of that. I felt decided. I drove back to Sudbury. I did not call my daughter. I did not send the message. I called my friend Audrey. No, not Audrey. That is not right. I will call her by the name she goes by. I called my oldest friend, Bernadette, who has known me since we were in Teachers College together in 1977, and I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, so what are you going to do?" The text came on a Thursday, mime. She said, "What are you going to do?" Because she knows me well enough to know that I had already figured it out. I called a real estate lawyer that Monday, not a realtor. A lawyer first to understand my position clearly. The cabin was in my name only. Harold and I had purchased it together, but when he died, I had updated all the documents. It was mine, legally and completely, and no one had any claim to it. The lawyer confirmed what I already knew. She also mentioned very gently that I might want to think about my estate planning, given what I had described. I told her I had already begun to think about that. I listed the cabin with a realtor in Perry Sound the following week. I did not tell my daughter. This was not cruelty. This was protection, not of myself, but of the conversation. I knew that if I told her before the sale was underway, her husband would find ways to complicate it. He would involve lawyers. He would make arguments. He would do what men like him do when something they have already decided belongs to them is threatened. The market on Bay in the spring of 2023 was still strong. I had 3 serious showings in the first 2 weeks, and an offer by the 3rd week of June. The offer came in at $940,000 for a cabin Harold and I had built ourselves on a property we had bought for $84,000. I accepted. The closing date was set for early July. I called my daughter on a Thursday evening, about a week before closing. I had thought carefully about how to have this conversation, and I had decided that thinking carefully was itself the wrong approach. I just called her. She answered on the 2nd ring. I told her that I had sold the cabin and that it would be closing in July. I told her I wanted her to hear it from me directly. I told her I loved her. There was a silence that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "You can't be serious." I told her I was very serious. She said her husband was going to be furious. I said I imagined he would be. I said the cabin was my property, in my name, purchased with money Harold and I had earned and saved together, and that I was within my rights to sell it whenever I chose to, and to whoever I chose to sell it to. I said I had tried for several years to continue sharing it with her family, and that had not worked out. She cried. My daughter cried, and I want to say something honest about that, because I know what some of you will be thinking. Some of you will think I am a hard woman. Some of you will think a mother should be softer, more forgiving, more willing to absorb this kind of treatment in order to keep the peace. I cried too later that evening, alone in my kitchen in Sudbury. I stood at the same window where I had looked at the birch trees in May, and I cried for the cabin, and for Harold, and for the version of my daughter I had raised, and for the gap between that version and the one I had been speaking to on the phone. I cried for a long time, but I did not change my mind. I want to tell you about what happened after the sale, because I think it is the most important part. The money sat in my account for about 3 weeks while I thought about what I wanted to do with the next chapter. I was 67 years old. I was healthy. I had my pension, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, which I am deeply grateful for. It is one of the reasons I stayed in teaching for as long as I did. And I had Harold's life insurance, modest but steady. I did not need the sale money to live. I called Bernadette, and then I called 2 other women, Cecily, who I had met through a watercolor class at the Flour Mill Art Center, and Noreen, who had been my neighbor on Kathleen Street for 11 years before she moved to a condo on the edge of Ramsey Lake. Both of them were widows. Both of them were, as I had come to understand, in some version of the same situation I was in, not with cabins necessarily, but with the experience of being quietly, persistently made to feel like a guest in their own lives. We started talking about what we actually wanted, not what we were supposed to want, not what was practical or sensible or appropriate for women our age. What we wanted. Bernadette wanted to be near the ocean. She had grown up in Newfoundland and had spent 40 years in northern Ontario, and she missed salt air the way you miss something you did not know was keeping you alive. Cecily wanted a garden, a real one, not a window box, raised beds and a cold frame and enough space to grow things seriously. Noreen wanted to stop being cold for 6 months of the year. I did not blame her. I wanted, and this surprised me a little, or maybe it did not. I wanted to build something again, not a building, something. A life that was deliberate and mine, constructed the way Harold and I had constructed the porch, carefully and with intention, and with my own 2 hands. We found a property in Prince Edward County, the 4 of us, a farmhouse on a county road just outside of Picton, with a good-sized main house and 2 smaller outbuildings that could be converted, and a market garden that had been running for 3 years and could keep running with the right people. 14 acres, south-facing slope, and when you stand in the right spot on the property, you can see the edge of Lake Ontario through the apple trees. It is not the bay. It will never be the bay. But it is something Harold would have recognized, a piece of land found by accident, or something that feels like accident, on a drive along a road you were not planning to take. We put in our offer in September. We closed in November. I moved in the following spring, just as the first asparagus was coming up in the garden beds. Thin, pale shoots pushing through cold ground, surprised to find themselves alive. The same way birch trees always are. My daughter has called twice since the sale. The first call was difficult. There were things said that I will not repeat here because they belonged to her and not to me to share. The second call was shorter and quieter and ended with her saying she was sorry. I told her I was sorry too, and I meant it because I was not for selling, but for the distance that had grown between us without either of us noticing until it was very wide. I do not know yet what that relationship will become. I am not a person who makes promises I cannot keep. What I know is this: I am sitting right now in a kitchen that smells like wood smoke and the beginning of a chicken soup I started this morning. Bernadette is in the next room arguing gently with a CBC radio program about something political. Cecily is outside in the cold frame, doing something she will explain to me later using terms I will not fully understand. Noreen flew to Puerto Vallarta in January and sends us photographs that make the rest of us simultaneously happy for her and unreasonably envious. On the wall above the kitchen table I have a photograph. Harold is in it. He is standing in front of the framed wall of what would become the cabin in the summer of 1999, holding a level and squinting at it the way he always squinted at things he was not quite sure were straight. He looks young. He looks happy. He looks like a man who has just found something worth building. I took that photograph. I still have it. He has been with me every place I have been, and he is here too. In this kitchen in Prince Edward County, in the smell of the soup and the wood and the cold spring light coming through a window, I picked myself. Some things cannot be taken. That is what I learned. Some things you carry with you simply because they are yours, and they were always yours, and no lock in the world can change that. I have thought about this a lot since we moved to Prince Edward County, not obsessively. I am not that kind of person, or I have tried not to be, but in the quiet way you think about things when you are doing dishes or walking the lane in the early morning before anyone else is up. What happened with the cabin was not simply about a property. It was about something older and more ordinary than that. When you give people access to something you love, you are also showing them what you value. And some people, when they see what you value, do not think, I will protect this for her. They think, I would like to have this. My son-in-law was not a monster. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easier if he were. He was a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the world reorganizes itself around people who push gently and persistently enough. And he was not wrong about that, exactly. The world does sometimes reorganize itself that way. It reorganized itself around him for several years, in fact, right up until it didn't. What I understand now is that I was part of that reorganization every time I said of course when I meant no. Every time I changed the subject instead of finishing the conversation. Every time I chose peace over clarity. I was not being kind. I was being unclear. And unclear boundaries are not a gift to the people around you. They are an invitation to keep testing. The text Thursday, I wish I had understood at 50, maybe at 40. The most caring thing you can do for the people you love is to be honest about what belongs to you and what does not. Not aggressive, not cold, just honest. Bernadette has always been that way. She says what she means, and she means what she says, and every person in her life knows exactly where they stand. I used to think that was a personality trait she was born with. I understand now that it is a choice she makes every day because she respects both herself and the people around her enough to be truthful with them. I also think about what it took, not just to sell the cabin, but to do what came after. To sit with 4 women around a kitchen table in Picton and say out loud, here is what I want, here is what I am willing to build, at 67. Starting again. There is a kind of clarity that only comes from having lost something and then having decided, not drifted, decided, what to do next. That decision does not come from nowhere. It comes from having thought carefully, from having looked at your own life honestly and without flinching, and from having trusted yourself enough to act on what you found when you looked. Harold built things with his hands. He measured twice. He checked the level. He did not rush the parts that needed time. I think I finally understand, at this age, that a life can be built the same way, slowly, with attention, with the willingness to start again if the first thing you built no longer serves you. The cabin is gone. What it gave me, the discipline Harold put into it, the years I spent caring for it, the understanding of what it meant to build something with purpose. I carried all of that here with me, to this kitchen, to this garden, to these 3 women who are, in their own ways, building the same thing. Some losses turn out to be the foundation of the next thing. You do not know that while you are sitting on the porch steps looking at the bay, but you find out, if you are patient enough and honest enough and willing enough to get in the car and drive toward whatever comes next,